Saudi Arabia on land and on sea, the multinational taking shape. Troops continue to arrive from Egypt, Syria, Morocco, and of course the U.S. And Pakistan says it too will send forces. Ships from the U.S., Britain, Australia, France, and the Netherlands are converging on the region to help impose sanctions against Iraq. The U.S. is giving the operation so far the thumbs up. Lawrence McGetty reports.
There's some international confusion about whether Western warships in the Gulf, like HMS Battleaxe, have the legal authority to stop vessels breaking UN sanctions. The French apparently think not, but today Foreign Office Minister William Waldegrave was sure the Navy could board sanction busters.
If there is evidence that sanctions busting is taking place, the Navy will be asked to take the necessary steps, yes.
Do you mean, therefore, that warships will be able to board offenders who are busting sanctions and stop the cargo being either loaded or offloaded?
If it was necessary for them to go that far, it would be possible for them to do so, yes.
Ironically, a tanker was unloading Iraqi oil today in New Jersey. American customs men said it wasn't sanction busting because the ship had sailed before the UN sanctions. At the Red Sea port of Yanbu, the Saudis turned away an Iraqi tanker waiting to load oil. This morning, 2 Australian guided missile frigates and a supply ship left Sydney to join the blockading force. The sea routes Iraq might use are now almost completely blocked by the gathering forces. HMS Battleaxe has arrived in the Gulf, joining British and American warships. Air support from RAF Tornado fighters stationed in Saudi Arabia and Jaguars in Oman is now in place. The Americans have carrier battle groups in the Indian Ocean, in the Red Sea, and another carrier due to arrive in the Mediterranean. With the French carrier Clemenceau joining the force, the naval grip on Iraq will be formidable. Lawrence McGinty, ITN, London.
In Baghdad, Iraqi citizens today poured into the streets in support of Saddam Hussein's holy war against the West. Anti-American rallies are not just limited to Iraq. Over the weekend, tens of thousands of Arabs turned out for similar protests in Jordan, Lebanon, Yemen, Algeria, and Somalia. Saddam Hussein has followers in the Israeli-occupied territories as well. Many Palestinians are hailing the Iraqi leader's call for Israel to remove itself from the territories. Israel has rejected the call and today used tear gas to break up pro-Iraqi demonstrations in the West Bank city of Nablus. The Saudi ambassador to the U.S. says Saddam Hussein has no room to talk about occupation forces.
President Saddam Hussein came and defeated the objective of our policy as Arabs to serve the Palestinian cause by occupying another Arab countries. How can we have moral high ground and say that Israel is wrong by occupying Arab land and accept an Arab country occupying an Arab land? So it is a tragedy by great dimensions.
President Bush's so-called working vacation may turn out to be more than relaxation. He'll leave his Kennebunkport, Maine retreat tomorrow to head back to Washington for 2 days. He'll hold budget talks tomorrow, and on Wednesday he'll hold a military briefing before heading back to Maine. The U.S. State Department, meanwhile, says about 600 Americans remain in Iraq because Baghdad is refusing to let them leave. Voice of America broadcast to Kuwait are warning about 2,500 Americans who are trapped there against trying to escape. State Department officials are advising them to wait for further instructions on how to get out.
Unfortunately, some U.S. media reports saying that the borders were all open caused somewhere to 40 to 50 carloads of Americans to drive to the Saudi border. They are there in blistering heat. The border obviously does not have facilities, i.e. water, etc.
Just outside the Persian Gulf, American warplanes are conducting exercises off the USS Independence, and planes carrying U.S. troops and supplies are landing at bases in Saudi Arabia about every 10 minutes. Naval pilots report no Iraqi aircraft sightings. They say they're more worried about ground attacks than air battles. The commander of the 6-vessel battle group says he has no direct orders to stop Iraqi shipping.
We need no help. We operate autonomous. If you give us the mission, then we will go in and do whatever defensive or offensive is required. But I do want to stress that we are here in a defensive mode to assist the Saudi Arabians in their request.
we all train over and over for what we're sent out here for. It's like if you're a football player, always getting to practice but never get to play a game. Now we get a chance to maybe play the game. So we all feel like we're really ready for it. And we just hope we don't do anything wrong.
If the hostilities do break out, there's always a chance that Saddam Hussein might order his armies to use chemical weapons against the Americans. Robert Vito reports.
Sand gets into everything. Temperatures are triple digit. The place, the Mojave Desert in California. The enemy, the desert itself.
You lack of water out here. You have the sun, and the sun is beating down on your head.
At Fort Irwin, armored vehicles roll across the desert floor. Helicopters sit waiting the order to climb into the air. Soldiers prepared for a chemical attack wear protective gear.
This suit is perfectly safe. I'm willing to stake my life on it. There's no question that this suit will protect you against chemical agents.
In this 1,000 square mile patch of desert at the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California, U.S. soldiers have been learning about surviving desert combat, learning to hide in a barren environment.
They learn how to use wadis, for example, gullies, to move large distances undetected. They learn to move at night so that they're undetected. They learn to move in the shadows of the mountains so that they're undetected.
The environment sometimes your number one enemy, and being out here you learn how to conquer that, how to identify terrain features on a map that they all look the same to the naked eye.
Dealing with poison gas is a high priority here. Soldiers are outfitted with full protective gear and exposed to tear gas to simulate chemical weapons.
When a unit defends himself against our simulated chemical attack, it's the same as if real chemicals had been used.
In this place that resembles the desert of Saudi Arabia, troops believe the training they get may one day save their lives in a desert war.
This kind of training means to me that it learns me, this is my first time on how to survive in the desert without injuring myself. If I injure myself as a medic, I'm no good to anybody else. My job is to save lives.
About 70,000 troops are trained here to fight in the desert each year. The action takes place day and night in temperatures as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Training officers say they know the troops will make mistakes here in the desert, but they hope the U.S. soldiers who may go fight in this kind of hostile climate overseas will have gotten the kind of experience they need to come back safe when the battle is done. Robert Vito, CNN, Fort Irwin, California.
Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry is expected to drop out of the Democratic Party today. A spokesman said that Barry plans to register as an independent.
A black and blue Monday for bourses around the world, with Frankfurt and Paris hitting 1990 lows. And gold prices soar on increasing uncertainty about the possibilities of full-scale war in the Middle East. Good evening, I'm Jan Hopkins. World stock markets have suffered further sharp sell-offs today after a weekend of watching events in the Middle East. Tokyo losing more than 4%, and all the major European bourses getting hit hard. A quick look shows the DAX index in Frankfurt fell nearly 2.5%. The CAC 40 in Paris down 3 1/3%, and in London prices off more than 0.5%. Analysts say it could be some time before we see buyers coming back into the markets.
If we have a level of the oil price and a political situation which we can count on for the next few months, then you can start going back to fundamentals and start bottom fishing at now very attractive levels. But while the uncertainty continues, I can't see much life coming back to the markets.
And it was not just the stock markets that were keeping an eye on developments in the Gulf. Commodities markets also moving sharply, but they were on the upside. Investors moving back into gold, with prices in London's spot market moving above the $400 mark in late London trading. That for the first time since March. We'll have more on gold prices and the outlook for precious metals later on World Business Tonight. And oil prices adding nearly $0.50 in late London trading as investors continue to expect fuel shortages and unrest in the Middle East. The price of North Sea Brent for September delivery rising 48 cents in late London trading to just under $26 a barrel. All of these markets reacting to the latest news from the Gulf today. Saudi Arabian officials turning away an Iraqi oil tanker as it tried to dock at a Saudi terminal. Failing to pick up Iraqi oil from the Saudi pipeline, the ship sailed away. In addition, sources say that the Saudis have now shut down the Iraqi pipeline. The first pictures were released today of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait 11 days ago. The amateur video was taken by a person who since fled Kuwait. Because of tensions in the Gulf, London-based Lloyd's insurers were reported to have doubled premiums on all Gulf-bound shipments and were refusing to insure shipments bound for Iraq or Kuwait unless a UN permit was available. The European community showing its concern for events in the Middle East. It's sending representatives from Italy, Ireland, and Luxembourg on a three-country tour beginning Thursday. The EC group will visit Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, three nations particularly affected by the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Last Friday, the EC agreed to hike economic support for Jordan, one of the poorer countries in the Middle East. Financial inequalities are at the root of the crisis in the Gulf. They're also behind the split among Arab nations. Tom Bogdanovich reports.
Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was welcomed in poorer parts of the Arab world. In Jordan and in the occupied territories, they celebrated and cheered. Saddam Hussein is a hero in those non-oil-rich countries whose citizens see almost nothing of the wealth that flows into the oil-rich Gulf states. The discrepancy between the rich and the poor Arab nations is very substantial. Gross domestic product per capita in Kuwait and in the United Arab Emirates is over $13,000 per annum. In Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, it's over $6,000, while in Jordan and Syria, the figure is well under $2,000, and in Egypt and Yemen, it's under $1,000. Poorer Arab countries envy the oil-rich Arab states and resent the close ties between the Gulf oil producers and their powerful ally, the United States. This latest Gulf crisis has sharpened what has always been a bitter split in the Arab world between the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots are likely to cash in. Egypt, which at last week's Arab summit voted to send forces to Saudi Arabia, is already the second largest recipient of American aid after Israel. The Gulf states' other major ally, Syria, may well extract a high financial price for its support in the current crisis. Tom Bogdanovich, World Business Tonight, London.
Joining me now is Middle East expert George Jaffe of the Economist Intelligence Unit, who has written extensively about Iraq and Iran. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. What about the situation in Iraq? How long can Saddam Hussein last?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. The CIA suggested he could last as long as 6 months, provided he's got sufficient reserves of grain, particularly. But given the very difficult financial situation that Iraq finds itself in, that seems difficult to believe. Indeed, 2 days ago, Saddam Hussein demanded that the Iraqi population should cut in half the amount of food they ate to guarantee that the country could weather the crisis.
And this is at the beginning of the crisis. He's asking for halving the...
That's indeed correct. And the problem that Iraq faces is simply its major source of currency, namely the sale of oil, is now being cut off almost completely. They had hoped to earn as much as $14 billion this year from oil sales, and that would have covered their imports of about the same amount. But now the oil's gone, it means they can no longer import food, and Iraq depends for the outside world on up to 70% of the food it consumes. That's a very serious situation.
There is a report today saying that the Iraqi economy actually is weaker going into this than in fact people thought. Is that your reading of the situation too?
Well, the Iraqi economy has been weak for the last decade, ever since the war with Iran broke out, and that's not really changed. Saddam Hussein had hoped that the increase in oil prices that he'd anticipated this year would reform the situation with the economy. But the problem is that Iraq has got massive foreign debt, up to $80 billion worth as a result of the war, of which a quarter is owed to the West. Now that debt has to be paid, even if the rest is not. And this year alone, Iraq was expected to pay back around $8 billion. Now that requires very large oil revenues indeed, and that of course now is no longer possible.
That's right. What about the situation? What is the likelihood that it's going to heat up from here and that in fact there will be some kind of explosion or spark?
Well, the problem, it seems to me, is that the two major protagonists, the United States on the one hand and Iraq on the other, have put themselves in positions from which they can't really retreat. It's inconceivable for the Iraqi population and for the Iraqi government that they should now abandon their claim to Kuwait. On the other hand, for the United States not to see that claim enforced, or rather the reverse of that claim enforced, is again unacceptable. And given that situation, there's plenty of reason for there to be a real confrontation between the two. If there were a confrontation, it's also difficult to see that that can avoid being a very bloody one indeed. And I'm afraid in the months to come, unless there's a very quick solution, it's difficult to anticipate an easy solution to the crisis.
And so for the U.S., this is going to be a very long involvement.
I think indeed it is. And in fact, even once the crisis is over, suppose the Saddam Hussein regime were to collapse, there will still be an involvement too, because the discredit given to the Gulf states in the eyes of the Arab world overall is so great now that I think the United States, with Western support, will have to stay in there to prop them up, even once the crisis itself is over. And that's a very bleak future to look forward to for the United States and for the Bush administration.
Did the Bush administration misjudge the situation?
I think to an extent it did, by not giving itself an opportunity to exploit all the diplomatic possibilities that really did exist, including many of those connected with the Arab world. Had they been exploited, and had the United Nations been used in a more frontal position, I think the Bush administration would have been in a far better position to find alternative solutions to the crisis than the confrontation that now exists.
Thank you very much. George Jaffe of the Economist Intelligence Unit. Stocks were lower at the open in New York following losses on bourses around the world. Myron Kandel is standing by in our New York bureau with the Wall Street close and the rest of the business news headlines in the United States.
Good evening, Jan. Despite a power failure that knocked out much of the trading on Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was able to pull off a winner today. The blue chip index fell to a 32-point loss in early trading, but finished with a gain of more than 30 points to close at 2746.78. The Standard & Poor's 500 index also finishing higher, up 3 1/3 points at 338.84. A fire in a power plant near Wall Street knocked out much of New York's financial district. The New York Mercantile Exchange and the American Stock Exchange both closed early as a result of the fire. Before the halt, however, oil was rallying on news that Iraq was threatening OPEC members who overproduce. A barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude gained 54 cents at $26.77. Precious metals were also rallying before trading was halted. Gold gained $8.30 an ounce at $405.20. Silver topped the $5 level, up 16 cents to $5.15. Currency trading in New York was slowed dramatically by today's power failure. However, the dollar continued to lose ground. It was off a fraction against the Japanese currency, down 1 1/4 pfennigs against the German mark, and off almost 1 cent against the British pound. In the U.S. credit markets, the Treasury's 30-year bellwether bond is lowered today, down 10/32 of a point, the yield up to 8.82%. And finally, the stock of UAL, parent of United Airlines, getting a boost today, up 2 5/8 at 110 1/8. That following a report that at least 4 more banks may join the 3 banks planning to finance a $4.3 billion employee-led buyout. That's the latest from the Business News Desk in New York. I'm Myron Kandel. Now back to Jan Hopkins in London.
Briefly, in European business news today, cash-hungry East Germany asked the Bundesbank for more than $500 million marks, $1/3 billion, in short-term credit in July, the first month of monetary unification. In July, East German ministries and regional governments had almost $750 million Deutschmarks, over $500 million, on deposit with the Bundesbank. Under the Monetary Union Treaty, East German authorities must put their assets with the Bundesbank, which then invests them. Swedish unemployment rising 0.4% in July to 1.5%. A year ago at this time, the jobless level stood at 1.2%. Swedish car maker Saab says car sales for this year could be stagnant at best. Last year, Saab sold 109,500 cars. But that will be difficult to match, says President David Herman, because the largest markets for sales, Sweden and Finland, are, quote, on the way down. Saab is owned by Saab Scania and General Motors. And finally, thousands of British North Sea oil workers staged yet another one-day strike today, the 4th in 10 days. According to the workers' non-authorized union, about 73 oil rigs are affected. Workers are demanding better working conditions and recognition of their union. Currently, British North Sea oil workers are not unionized. When World Business Tonight returns, Eurotunnel trying to dig into banking pockets for more money. We'll have that story for you after this. Stay with us.
From this podium, I would like to greet all the press who are here today. And I came specially carrying a verbal message to President Bush from the Emir of the State of Kuwait expressing my country's and my Emir appreciation and thanks and gratitude for all the position, the positive position and support we've had from the American people, the American administration, and first of all, the American president. Having said that, to eliminate all the invasion and occupation we've had over our territory by Iraq.
Saudi TV has released its first pictures from Kuwait since the invasion. This tape was shot by an amateur photographer traveling in the capital. And Tuesday's New York Times reports Iraq confiscated $3 to $4 billion worth of gold bullion, currency, and goods from Kuwait. The seized items are reportedly transferred to financial institutions in Baghdad. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney will return to Saudi Arabia later this week. He'll meet with that nation's leaders and American troops. Iraq continues to deny it has plans to invade Saudi Arabia, but American and Saudi troops are reportedly swarming along the Saudi border with Kuwait just in case. Here's more from Wolf Blitzer.
Stinger anti-aircraft missiles and Patriot ground-to-air missiles are now in place in Saudi Arabia. And these F-15 and F-16 jet fighters are ready to engage Iraq's Air Force. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney will inspect U.S. firepower firsthand when he returns to Saudi Arabia on Friday. With all this equipment poised for action, plus thousands of U.S. ground troops, Pentagon officials say Iraqi President Saddam Hussein has missed his best chance to invade Saudi Arabia. The U.S. can now use its air superiority over Iraq.
I think if it came to war, the first thing the Air Force would do for us, the Air Force and Navy Air as well, is to establish air control. That is, we would sweep the Iraqi Air Force from the skies.
U.S. satellites have scanned virtually every square yard of Iraq and occupied Kuwait, pinpointing every strategic target. Satellite photos show some 150,000 Iraqis are now in Kuwait, with another 50,000 just north of the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. To meet that challenge, the Pentagon continues to pour troops and equipment into Saudi Arabia. Privately, U.S. officials suggest that 50,000 U.S. ground troops already have either landed in Saudi Arabia or are on the way. Officials say preparations are underway to send another 50,000 in the coming weeks. And if there is a shooting war with Iraq, say military planners, the troop commitment will double yet again. Within a few weeks, there could be as many as 50,000 U.S. sailors in the region as well. With all the muscle flexing on both sides, what worries Pentagon planners most right now is the prospect of a war by accident. There are a lot of edgy military officers on both sides. One miscalculation, one missile fired by a trigger-anxious pilot, for example, could set in motion a full-scale war. The Iraqi posture in Kuwait appears defensive. There's no sign that Saddam Hussein is about to attack Saudi Arabia. But there's no let-up to the tension. And Pentagon officials concede that pumping men and weapons into Saudi Arabia may raise the odds of a fatal mistake. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, the Pentagon.
Many countries are joining the effort to cut off all shipping from Iraq. On Monday, Britain sent 3 Royal Navy minesweepers to join 3 other British warships in the Gulf. Australia also dispatched naval forces expected to reach the Middle East in 3 weeks. There are also unconfirmed reports Syria is recalling some troops from Lebanon for possible deployment to the Persian Gulf. There are reports Jordan's forcing ships to break the United Nations boycott of Iraq. The owners of the Norwegian ship Tanga claim the Jordanian police forced the crew to unload grain for Iraq at the Jordanian port of Aqaba. The entire cargo should be off by Tuesday morning. Reports from Israel indicate Iraq is getting around the boycott by using that Jordanian port. Now, this despite the fact that Jordan's promised to abide by the economic embargo. The economic interdiction of Iraq could be very costly for Turkey. It stands to lose more than $2 billion from the UN sanctions against Baghdad. Richard Blystone reports Turkey's president is taking some heat for thrusting his country into the crisis.
This crumbling fortress defended Ankara for nobody really knows how many hundreds of years. But nowadays, deciding where Turkey's lines of defense should be drawn isn't so easy. Opposition leaders told a special session of the Turkish parliament Sunday that President Turgut Özal had exceeded his constitutional powers by holding discussions with foreign leaders and by cutting off the pipeline that carried Iraqi oil through Turkey to the Mediterranean without consulting the National Assembly. Erdal İnönü declared Turkey doesn't want to be drawn into war with its neighbor to the southeast. Özal protested he's done no more than reaffirm Turkey's obligations to the United Nations and to NATO. The president sought broad powers for the government he dominates to declare war and send troops to operations like the multinational force without putting it to the parliament. The parliament gave him instead a watered-down confirmation of power to act if Turkey is attacked. Turks are already feeling the crisis. Young men who've recently completed military service are being told where to report in case of war. The company that makes gas masks and chemical filters has been ordered to double production. F-16 fighters, the cream of Turkey's Air Force, are reported to have been moved closer to the Iraqi border. Turkey's 800,000-man armed forces are almost as big as Iraq's, second only to the U.S. in NATO. The bravery and iron discipline of Turkish soldiers are legendary. But Turkey's military strategy and capabilities are focused on defending Turkish soil, not on projecting power hundreds of miles away. And much of its weaponry is antiquated, armor of Korean War vintage, and except for about 50 F-16s, aircraft dating from the Vietnam era. But around the Iraqi border, Turkish troops have been busy with Kurdish guerrillas who slip back and forth across the frontier, fighting for an independent nation. Man for man, the Turkish troops are probably more than a match for the Iraqis. But there are many here who are pointing out that while Iraqi missiles can't reach Washington, they're perfectly capable of dropping their poison gas on the Turkish capital. Much of eastern Turkey is within Iraqi missile range. But as in the far south, along the Saudi frontier, the specter of chemical weapons has changed not only the battlefield equation, but the way this country looks at the prospect of war. Richard Blystone, CNN, Ankara.
A shortcoming that is most deceptive if the specialist is intentionally pushing an agenda.
Yeah, I call these experts Rolodex commandos, and the reason I do is because they are available and they have pretty predictable points of view.
I think those some of the analysts that they use are kooks, quacks, and way out of date.
While he believes network coverage of the Kuwait-Iraq conflict has been fair, Bozell argues that networks usually run only to liberal specialists for analysis.
The Saddam initiative today seemed to appeal to the Arab masses. What is your reaction to this?
And he accuses networks of resorting to analysis to keep an aging story fresh. If the current Middle East conflict becomes a stalemate, he warns, networks will begin asking analysts questions like, is this another Vietnam?
It's always just a very sexy thing for the media to say, is blank another Vietnam? They've been doing that since Vietnam, and why not start with this one?
But if the best viewer is an informed viewer, then the most valuable analyst is the one best able to explain difficult problems and sometimes make unpopular predictions. The key seems to be separating analysts who simply hold opinions from those trying to carve policy. Alexander Kippen for CNN, Washington.
American girl who was stranded in Kuwait is back with her family. Patricia Kelly has her story from Paris.
Penelope was finally reunited with her mother and father in Paris. Then she talked about her 10-day ordeal.
I realized I was trapped in a war zone when we moved to the airport hotel, because from there we were on the second floor. And from our window we could see all the troops going into the airport grounds and runways. And we could see lots of tanks and trucks carrying men with arms. And my feelings were that they were just doing that to get attention and to show Kuwait that they were strong and that they really wanted this land.
Her father revealed he'd been given a CIA map of the region to track his daughter's progress from Baghdad through no man's land to freedom in Jordan.
My family and I are, of course, inexpressibly grateful for the unusual convergence of factors which have secured Penny's release and put an end to our particular non-stop 10-day nightmare.
Her French-born mother, Isabel, said she intended to contact the American diplomats who brought Penske, as she's known to the family, out with them to thank them for looking after her. It was a calm and collected little girl who recounted her adventures without even omitting a single detail. Penelope wants to go up the Eiffel Tower while she's here. She's one of the lucky ones. There are still many hundreds of other Americans trapped in Kuwait and Iraq. Their future is still uncertain. Patricia Kelly, CNN, Paris.
And headline news, I'm Gordon Graham. U.S. troops are said to be arriving in Saudi Arabia every 10 minutes or so. The chief of the U.S. military mission to the Desert Kingdom says the U.S. defense team grows stronger with each day. These are the first pictures of U.S. ground forces in Saudi Arabia. The Pentagon still refuses to release exact numbers of U.S. troops in the region, but says some figures may be released in a few days. It's believed that 50,000 U.S. troops are either in Saudi Arabia or on their way. The soldiers say they're ready for an Iraqi attack.
He was already practicing, going through maneuvers, drills. So before this happened, it was like he was already kind of ready for it. He just like, they called us and we had to get other things that we needed.
Any emotion when they called?
I wouldn't say any emotion. We kind of thought about it and kind of like expected it, but we wasn't sure.
President Bush has ordered Defense Secretary Dick Cheney to fly to Saudi Arabia Friday. Cheney will visit U.S. troops and meet with leaders of the oil-rich kingdom. That's his second meeting with them since the crisis began. Pentagon officials say an acceptable chain of command has not yet been arranged between the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other international forces. Goods to Baghdad. The New York Times reports at least $3 billion in gold, currency, and other goods have been transferred to institutions in Iraq. Jonathan Mann has more on Iraqi efforts to withstand international pressure.
The streets of Baghdad were swollen with seething anger. Thousands of people poured out of their workplaces and homes to show their support for Saddam Hussein. Virtually every one of them has paid some kind of price for Iraq's 8 years of war against Iran. But they seemed ready nonetheless for another conflict against the combined forces of Arab and Western armies. Meanwhile, Iraq looked for help from the people of the countries allied against it. Iraqi radio called on Egyptians to move against Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak, the man who's led the Arab League's response to the Iraqi threat. Stop Mubarak's treason, Iraqi broadcasts said. Stop also, it said, Western warships from moving through the Suez Canal. But within hours, the French carrier Montcalm was moving through the narrow waterway unimpeded. Iraq's urging was, for the moment at least, ignored. Egyptians were following Mubarak's lead, signing up on the street to defend Saudi Arabia against possible attack, enlisting outside the gates of its Cairo embassy.
Even if it was my father who just got out of his grave to invade Saudi Arabia, I would stand against him and tell him it was wrong.
Across town, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, John Kelly, arrived from Saudi Arabia to continue consultations with senior Egyptian officials, an expected two-day visit to the Egyptian capital. The exiled government of Kuwait was active as well, announcing plans to field some kind of army, Kuwaiti Contras, from any country that would have it.
And we're not going to leave any stone until to go and get our right back.
Those are the desperate words of a government forced into exile, still trying to free its country, something that much of the Arab world and all of the West has so far been unable to do. Jonathan Mann, CNN, Cairo.
The international effort against Iraqi President Saddam Hussein may be losing some of its solidarity. The Washington Post says 4 members of the United Nations Security Council questioned the U.S. decision to stop ships going to and from Iraqi and Kuwaiti ports. Meanwhile, NATO officials report food shortages in Iraq, a sign the embargo is working. This is the latest video CNN has obtained showing Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion. An amateur photographer shot the footage while driving through Kuwait City. A Saudi TV commentator says the cars shown had been stripped by Iraqi soldiers so the parts could be sent to Baghdad. Meanwhile, Kuwait's government in exile has reportedly organized small resistance forces that are launching raids from Saudi Arabia against Iraqi forces in Kuwait. President Bush will take a 2-day break from his vacation in Kennebunkport to return to Washington. He's due to arrive sometime this afternoon. He'll meet with advisors to discuss the situation in the Middle East. The foreign minister of Kuwait arrived in Washington early today, and he hopes to meet with President Bush later to convey a message from Kuwait's exiled emir, thanking Mr. Bush for America's support in the Gulf crisis. The State Department says about 500 more Americans are now free in Saudi Arabia after escaping from Kuwait. This departure leaves almost 2,500 civilian Americans in Kuwait. And officials say at least 500 are still trapped in Iraq. Iraqi authorities still will not let the civilians go, but 10 U.S. Embassy employees left for home Saturday. More are expected to leave this week. For many Iraqi Americans, the crisis in the Persian Gulf is creating personal conflicts. Nancy Nazarian reports their allegiance is divided between two countries.
Sal Farhan is one of many Iraqi Americans who feel caught in the middle of the Middle East crisis. He doesn't want to see American lives lost or see his relatives in Baghdad suffer. But he and many others say the invasion wouldn't have happened had the Gulf states helped Iraq more during the Iran-Iraq war.
Kuwait were selling, as a lot of people know, the barrel of oil for $12. And I believe that was very, very low, and that was a price to hurt Iraq economically.
Farhan's brother Sam, who helps him run this printing business, is trapped along with his wife and young son in Iraq. The irony of owning a gas station isn't lost on Aladdin Camas, and neither is the meaning of the struggle between his new home and his motherland.
I have a nephew. He's in the Air Force. He's going to be fighting his cousins over there. I mean, just put it together. See how the picture's going to look like. Look ugly.
Both Camas's and Farhan's families are okay, but like many other Iraqi Americans, they know their relatives' fates are tied to the U.S. presence in the region.
The United States trying to defend Saudi Arabia, but I think the Arabs should settle that.
Let them solve it by, themselves. It's not like the United States problem.
Many Iraqis insist the United States is overreacting and agree with Saddam Hussein that Iraq's occupation of Kuwait is no different from Israel or Syria's occupation of other Middle East territories. But some in the Assyrian-Iraqi community want the United States to hold its ground, principally because Assyrians are a Christian minority in Iraq.
If there is, a chance that the United States is going to go against that country, I'll be the first one on the line to go against that country.
They live in the same community and shop at the same stores, but Assyrian Iraqis and Muslim Iraqis are often at odds with one another. The Middle East crisis has helped them find common ground.
We don't want to pay our tax money for bullets of Americans to kill our family, and we don't want that bullets of our family there kill Americans.
However it's accomplished, Iraqi Americans want a peaceful solution to the crisis. And after a long and bloody war with Iran, they say it's time to put down arms and rhetoric and mend the economy. Nancy Nazarian for CNN, Chicago.
Good morning, American Consulate.
Good morning. Could you connect me with the American Services section?
One moment.
American Services, good morning.
Morning.
I'm a U.S. citizen.
Yes.
I live in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could give me the latest information on that area, since I'm supposed to be returning there soon.
It's very dangerous, sir, and I will read you our travel advisory. Hold on for a second.
Okay. Yes, I do.
Let me check in case I have something else.
Miss, did you say very dangerous situation?
Of course, yes. Due to the Iraqi military invasion of Kuwait and continuing unstable conditions in the region, the Department of State advises all Americans to defer all travel to the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Which means, of course, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. The department is permitting dependents of U.S. government officials to depart the area on a voluntary basis. The department advises other American citizens in the area to consider doing the same. This is it.
That's the travel advisory from the State Department?
That's the travel advisory we have for Saudi Arabia, including Qatar, Bahrain, and
United Arab Emirates.
Yes.
Now, I'm here in Athens on holiday with my family. I have a wife and 4 children. We've been living in Dhahran for 10 years.
Yes.
I have a job there and I'm expected to be back this week.
Why don't you call them?
Well, I did call them yesterday and they told me that the company I work for, which is the Saudi Arabian Oil Company, formerly the Arabian American Oil Company, has officially stated that there is no emergency and it's pretty much business as usual. However, the company I work for is doing the same thing that the embassy personnel are doing. They're allowing dependents to get out on a voluntary basis. But they are not asking anybody to leave at this time. And they say the situation appears very normal in Dhahran.
Yeah,
So I'm wondering why your travel advisory says the situation there is extremely dangerous.
What can I say, sir? That's what I have. I read it to you.
Okay.
But why don't you take the advice of your company and go there?
And see what's happening.
Yes, I think, yeah.
Okay.
I think that's the wise thing to do.
Now, the travel advisory in this case, since there are no real hostilities taking place, it's just an advisory. If war broke out, for example, then they would not allow U.S. citizens to go. Is that right?
Just the travel advisory warning, though, warning. There are 2 kinds of travel advisories. The usual one, which is just a travel advisory, and the warning one, which is more serious than the regular travel advisory we receive.
And is this the warning one?
This is a warning one, yes.
Okay, so it is a serious statement from the government. Okay. Well,
why don't you go there by yourself, find out, and then tell your family to come or not come to meet you?
yeah, that's what I plan to do actually, because
I think, yes.
I don't have another option.
Yeah, you don't have other option. You just fly there, see by yourself, estimate the situation, and then ask your family to come or not to.
Okay. Thank you for your help.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Yes, Athano. Good morning. Is that the Saudi consulate?
Hold on a minute.
Saudi consulate?
Excuse me?
Is this the Saudi consulate?
Yes.
Good morning. I'm a U.S. citizen. I work for the Saudi Arabian Oil Company in Dhahran.
Yes.
I'm supposed to be returning to work there, and I'm wondering if you can give me any information concerning the situation there.
What is your name, please?
Name is Bill Harlan.
Bill Harlan, U.S. citizen, and you're working for the oil?
Yeah, for Aramco, Saudi Aramco.
Just a moment, just a moment.
In Dhahran.
Just a moment, if the consul is in his office, I will ask him.
Thank you.
Just a moment.
Yes?
Yes, you can go back and work.
Okay.
Be afraid.
As far as the Saudi consulate is concerned, there's no immediate danger or problem there?
No, you can go back and work.
Okay, anything else you can tell me about the situation?
No, nothing. They told me to tell you that there is no danger.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I was in Panama too, so I'm kind of used to this kind of, atmosphere. But our biggest concern is chemical. We aren't, we never had to worry about that before. Even in training, we never took it that seriously, but we took it. Soldiers are really learning about it right now.
Defense Secretary Dick Cheney travels to Saudi Arabia Friday for the second time since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. He's expected to reiterate the U.S. commitment to defending Saudi Arabia and review troops. Cheney will do that same when he visits Fort Stewart today. Ryan Cabell reports from the Georgia military base.
They are the first of the troops from Fort Stewart to be officially deployed to Saudi Arabia. 100 Army support personnel, fully outfitted, fully armed, complete even with chemical warfare protection kits. An uncertain future ahead, but the troops take a business-like approach.
It's not really affected me right now. It's just kind of a stage to do what you're told to do, get the job done so we can get on our mission, get on our way.
At least 4 Navy ships are scheduled to leave Savannah in the next few days, each loaded with up to 1,200 vehicles and pieces of equipment. Tanks, artillery, armored personnel carriers, trucks, and jeeps. The troops of the 24th Infantry Division, up to 17,000 of them, may also deploy.
I will be back. Nothing to worry about, sir.
That's what Private James Meeks says, but his family, who drove all the way from Ohio, wasn't so sure.
It's finally reality. You don't want to believe it until you're actually seeing this happen. And now you know it's true. He's leaving.
He did finally leave on board the ship Capella early Monday afternoon. The Meeks family got their last glimpse of him for what will likely be months. To the strains of Georgia on My Mind, the Army wives said farewell to their men on Monday. The troops of the 24th Infantry face a 10-day journey at sea to a destination that's not quite at war, yet certainly not at peace either. Most of the 24th Infantry still hasn't left for Saudi Arabia. They'll be following in the days ahead, but not before Defense Secretary Dick Cheney speaks to the troops Tuesday morning. Brian Cabell, CNN, Savannah, Georgia.
The White House says the naval barricade of Iraq has forced a few ships to turn back at sea. Great Britain and Australia say they'll also help interdict Iraqi ships. British minesweepers are now en route to the Persian Gulf. Yesterday, Pakistan voted to send troops to help defend Saudi Arabia, and Syria agreed to send a so-called symbolic contingent of soldiers. The Pentagon says the chain of command involving the multinational forces hasn't been worked out yet, nor have the specifics of engaging and stopping ships to and from Iraq. Some members of the United Nations Security Council are apparently unhappy with the U.S. interdiction. Today's Washington Post reports France, Canada, the Soviet Union, and Malaysia are criticizing Secretary of State James Baker's announcement that the U.S. would stop or turn away ships headed to or from Iraqi or Kuwaiti ports. President Bush is shuttling back to Washington today from his vacation home in Maine. He stayed out of the public eye yesterday, making calls and taking out his fishing boat. Mr. Bush will attend a military briefing and meet with his economic advisors to discuss the costs of the Persian Gulf strategy and the federal deficit. Up to 600 Americans are still stranded in Iraq, and the number of civilian Americans in Kuwait has dropped to 2,500. The State Department says 500 have been able to sneak into Saudi Arabia from Kuwait. False news reports said the Kuwait-Saudi Arabian border was open, and many carloads of Americans who tried to flee were chased back.
I don't have, as of this briefing, a further characterization except that they were stacked up there at the border, 40 or 50 of them, that it was blistering hot, that this location has no facilities to deal with this, and that we were trying with our limited personnel that we have on the ground there to go out and help these people.
Kuwait's exiled foreign minister will meet with Secretary of State James Baker and other top officials today. He arrived in Washington early today to thank President Bush for aggressively going after Iraq. He travels to New York tomorrow for meetings with the United Nations Secretary General. Iraq is apparently emptying Kuwait of its sellable goods. Saudi television says new cars in the tiny emirate have been stripped and their parts sent to Iraq. Machinery, food, and medical equipment are also reportedly being confiscated. The New York Times reports Iraq has transferred from Kuwait $3 to $4 billion in gold bullion, currency, and goods, apparently increasing Iraqi reserves by more than 50%. And the Los Angeles Times says today's raids on Kuwait could eventually amount to $50 billion. Israel is keeping a watchful eye on the Gulf conflict. Its government, however, is trying to calm fears that Iraq poses a threat there, as Linda Scherzer reports.
A tense kind of calm prevails in Israel these days. The threat of a Gulf war isn't causing panic here. No one is preparing bomb shelters. No one is stocking up on food supplies. Few people seem really worried about an Iraqi attack on Israel, but everyone is keeping a close eye on the Gulf.
There is a big concern, but no more than that.
The situation right now is bad. We know about that, but we are not afraid as it was in 73 or 67.
Tourists are worried. Travel agents report they've been swamped with calls from overseas. Some have been cancellations. The parents of this young American tourist are concerned about war.
They're anxious for me to come home, and I'm kind of anxious to go home.
Older Israelis who lived through war are also anxious. Shoshana Schreiber carries the memories and a personal badge from World War II. This woman's nephew was killed in the Six-Day War. They don't forget the past, a past that makes Saddam Hussein's threat seem more real.
His main goal is to destroy us.
In fact, some Israelis are so worried about an Iraqi chemical weapons attack they were out buying gas masks. This store sold 500 masks last week when they normally sell only 4. Customers say they aren't hysterical, but they are taking Hussein seriously.
I believe that this madman has the ability to do what he says.
To calm fears, Israeli defense officials have hit the airwaves, reassuring the country that Iraq poses no immediate threat to Israel, that Iraq's ballistic missiles have no chemical warheads. Doctors who've studied the effects of war on Israel believe the people are listening and that they have their fears in check.
I think that people have developed certain coping mechanisms which allow them to go on with their daily business and not be too disturbed by or upset by the things that go on all the time.
Israel's civil defense has gas masks for every man, woman, child, and tourist. They're being stored in warehouses throughout the country. That Israel hasn't distributed the gas masks reflects the view of top military leaders here that such a move would only create panic. Panic that could add fuel to the tensions here that have already been heightened by a conflict in the Gulf that Israel clearly wants to stay out of. Linda Scherzer, CNN, Jerusalem.
Despite the U.S. military action in the Persian Gulf, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney is making some big defense cuts back home. Cheney intends to trim the defense budget by $7 billion over the next 4 years. The plan calls for cutting construction of the 2 Seawolf nuclear attack submarines and 9 surface combat ships. Jordan is another nation not following in U.S. footsteps. A key oil pipeline and a road between Iraq and Jordan are still open for business. Doug James reports.
On the main road between Jordan and Iraq, the wheels of commerce are still turning. Boycott or not, trucks laden with a variety of goods are plying their cargo across the border. And Iraqi freighters can still be seen in the southern Jordanian port of Aqaba, a lifeline for goods destined for Baghdad. But analysts here deny that Jordan is using the port as a conduit for supplies to Iraq in deliberate defiance of UN sanctions.
You cannot expect a ship to have arrived in Aqaba and the letter of credit had been opened only 5 days ago or 6 days ago. So it must have been contracted much earlier than that.
Still, Jordan will be in no hurry to impose sanctions against its neighbor. King Hussein has promised to do so, but appears to be stalling for time. His government, which still has not spelled out precisely how the trade embargo would be enforced, may ask for a partial reprieve from the UN order because of the potentially devastating effect on the Jordanian economy.
We will stand to lose somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion to $2 billion between now and the end of the year alone.
That's because Jordan and Iraq are each other's best trading partner. Jordan gets almost all its oil from Iraq, and Iraq imports 25% of its agricultural and manufactured goods from Jordan. Even with a Mercedes engine under the hood, the journey between Amman and the Iraqi border is a long one. At least 6 hours under the hot desert sun. But Jordan's truckers seem determined to ply their trade until forced to stop. Doug James, CNN, Amman.
Kuwait's exiled foreign minister is in Washington to thank President Bush for the American action against Iraqi aggression. Mr. Bush breaks from his main vacation to return to the nation's capital today. The Kuwaiti diplomat is expected to meet with other White House officials on behalf of Kuwait's deposed emir, who is in exile in Saudi Arabia. Pictures of Kuwait's takeover are now backing up reports. Videotape shot by an amateur photographer shows the damage from the invasion. Meanwhile, Iraq has apparently caused some financial damage to Kuwait. Reports today say Iraqi troops have looted the central bank of Kuwait of billions of dollars in gold and cash. The funds apparently make up for the millions of dollars Iraqi President Saddam Hussein is losing because of UN sanctions. The U.S. State Department says about 2,500 Americans are stranded in Kuwait and up to 600 others are in Iraq. The Iraqis are giving no indication as to when they'll let the Americans leave. Candy Crowley reports.
While small groups of Americans have crossed out of Iraq since the Gulf crisis began, most Westerners who want to leave still cannot. This despite what the State Department describes as hourly discussions in Washington and Iraq.
We are reminding the government of Iraq at every opportunity of their responsibility for the security and welfare of American citizens in Iraq and in Kuwait. Their response so far to our repeated request to permit those Americans who wish to depart Iraq and Kuwait has been unacceptable.
Iraq is allowing diplomats to leave, and several American officials in Baghdad are expected to depart within the next several days. But the picture is less clear for private citizens. Since the Iraqi invasion, about 500 Americans have managed to get out of Kuwait. 2,500 others are still there, an additional 500 to 600 remain in Iraq. Businessman Patrick Schenning was among a small group of the fortunate, managing to cross the border from Iraq into Jordan late last week.
We had actually gotten together, the five of us, to sit down and plan how we might go the next day when we heard the report that the troops were coming. And so we abandoned the planning effort and just went outside and across the street to the hotel across the street and essentially rented taxi cabs.
But many others, encouraged by erroneous reports, were stopped at the Kuwaiti-Saudi border.
Unfortunately, some U.S. media reports saying that the borders were all open caused somewhere to 40 to 50 carloads of Americans to drive to the Saudi border. They are there in blistering heat. The border obviously does not have facilities, i.e. water, etc.
In addition, tens of thousands of Egyptian workers remain stranded. Distraught family members demonstrated in Cairo, demanding information on their whereabouts and well-being. The State Department believes Iraq's promise of free passage applies only to Africans, South Asians, and Latins. Although those Americans inside Kuwait and Iraq are not allowed to leave, the U.S. still insists they are not hostages. But behind each effort to get them free, there is the underlying fear that if Saddam Hussein comes to feel too cornered by U.S. forces or economic sanctions, those Westerners still within his grip could become bargaining chips of the last resort. Candy Crowley, CNN, the State Department.
We'll have more on how the Gulf crisis is affecting financial markets later in our Dollars and Cents report.
Meanwhile, Rick, hundreds of thousands of foreigners remain trapped in Kuwait and Iraq despite promises by Baghdad that it would do all it could to facilitate their move from Iraq and Kuwait to their homelands. Thousands did manage to escape in the last several days. Hundreds of them were Asians who said that they did not encounter any problems with the Iraqi troops after the government announced it would facilitate their release. But some disturbing reports are reaching us, reports of beatings, rapes, and robberies. This issue could become very explosive. The U.S. has avoided calling them hostages, but at the same time, we have to remember that this all could trigger military action if Americans or other foreigners were endangered by the Iraqi military presence. I'm Jim Clancy reporting live from the CNN News Center in Cairo.
All right, thanks, Jim. And still to come on Early Bird, parts of the normally hot and dry West are in for a cool, wet day. Meteorologist Valerie Voss will have the forecast.
The Los Angeles Times says there is a plan to open 3 new fronts on Iraq's border with Syria and Iran, and within Iraq among Kurdish separatists. That plan is attributed to the governments of Kuwait and other Mideast nations. Kuwait's exiled foreign minister may mention it during meetings today in Washington. He arrived this morning from Saudi Arabia to thank U.S. officials for intervening in the crisis. President Bush will also be in Washington today, interrupting his main vacation to confer with economic advisors and get a military briefing. The president has ordered Defense Secretary Dick Cheney to go to the Persian Gulf area on Friday.
As we have reported, some U.S. forces heading to the Middle East are being told to expect a long stay. Joining us now from Saudi Arabia live is U.S. Navy Captain Mike Sherman, who is director of the Joint Information Bureau in Saudi Arabia. Captain Sherman, good morning. I'm wondering, with that in mind, the long stay, how are the U.S. contingents taking all of this? What's their attitude there?
I think the morale is extremely high here, Rick. The kids know what they're here for, and they're here to do a good job, and everybody's digging right in.
As we just mentioned, it's being reported that planes have been landing about every 10 minutes, offloading troops and equipment. How much longer will this operation be going on, and will it stay at that intensity?
Well, it'll stay at whatever intensity level the Department of Defense wants us to stay at this point. We're gearing up. We're getting the troops in, as the Secretary of Defense has said in his briefings, to deter the Iraqis from any further aggression and to assist the Saudis in their efforts here. And we're working very closely with the Saudis. They're cooperating extremely well with all of us, and we'll stay here until the job's done.
All right, let's talk about these other countries, especially the members of the Arab League states. As Susan just mentioned, even Syria sending in troops. We have troops from Egypt, Morocco, and Pakistan today is reported to be sending troops. Is this going to be difficult, coordinating all of the various troops who are coming in with the U.S., with the Saudi forces?
You know, it's interesting because we do exercise with a lot of these countries throughout the year, and various exercises with our fleets and with our troops and armies throughout the year, as I said. So I don't think there'll be any particularly difficult areas. We all know we're all doing the business that we've been trained to do, and I think we'll all work together fairly well. There's going to be obviously some complications. I think we'll get over those.
What about the chain of command?